our speaker, Alex Opalic. He is a full-stack developer with over 7 years of experience, specializing in Vue.js and modern web technologies. He currently works at Otto Payments, where he builds scalable and reliable applications. Outside of work, Alex shares his expertise through talks and on his blog, alexop.dev. He is passionate about clean, practical engineering and helping others level up their craft. Alex, it's an honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you for a nice introduction. Share my screen. Okay. Hope you could see it. Now let's start. Yeah, I changed my title. So I don't know what it was original, but I thought I name it All You Need Is Vue and Not Love. So let's talk about Vue today. And just like yesterday, I saw this maybe spicy tweet from someone, Justin Schröder, who has written, what framework is major as React, faster than Solid, easier than Svelte, less captured than all of them. It's Vue forks, it always has been. So I like these kind of spicy tweets, and maybe there's some truth to that, maybe also not. That's why I hope I can give you an introduction, because preparing this talk was a bit hard because, yeah, we don't have 1 week or 1 month. And if you learn a new framework like Vue or React or Angular, there are so many things that you can get into it. And that's why I would also say it helps if you know the basics, TypeScript, HTML, and CSS, because the way I learned Vue was not the best way, because I only knew Java, and at my first job as a working student, I was learning Vue by writing tests for components. So it was a bit painful, but I also learned many things. So that's why I try to give you now introduction about the most important things Vue related, and I hope this inspires you a little bit and you are more interested about this framework. But yeah, I already got a nice introduction, but just quickly, yeah, I've been working for 7 years as a developer and always with Vue. I'm a developer at Otto Payments. I live in Germany, in Gerzit, a town near Munich. And I also write blog posts. Most of the topics are related to Vue, but I also share about testing, GraphQL, and also about AI. So if you want to know more about Vue, you will find many of my blog posts there. Now, why does Vue exist? So I think it's interesting to look a bit in the past and about the story. So Evan Vue created Vue. And he has an interesting CV because he was not studying informatics directly. So he has an art background. I think this is interesting. And then he was learning JavaScript by himself, and he joined Google. And as you know, Google has developed Angular. And he didn't like Angular so much for what he had to do, because Angular gives you many rules, but he just needed a reactive way to build front-end applications. That's why he thought, yeah, why can I not extract the parts that I like Angular, but I simplify it? And then he started with Vue as a personal project in his free time. And 2014, so 11 years ago, he released Vue on GitHub. Now, 11 years is a long time, and many things also have changed in Vue. Just maybe a quick recap about the most important things. So every framework needs a router. That's why we also have Vue router. For more complex things, you also need a state management. So if you know React, then you have Redux. This was kind of the Vuex equivalent. And on the React side, you have Zustand, but we have Pinia. Then also more important because of SEO and performance, meta frameworks. That's why Next was created, where you can also have server-side rendering and can build full-stack applications. And even if you don't use Vue, you also probably use something that was kind of created because of Vue and Vite. And yeah, this is a better tool than Webpack, and now it powers many frameworks. So not only Vue, also many React frameworks. I think the only bigger framework that is not using Vite is Next.js from the React side. And also Vue has really nice dev tools and that can help you to debug your problem. I think this is also unique to Vue. I don't think React has this kind of quality when it comes to dev tools. And if you like to watch documentations, there is a nice documentary out there on YouTube. I think 5 years old, but you see kind of the history, and I like these documentations because we spend so much time when we work with this framework. So it's also nice to know a bit more about the people who created the frameworks that we like. And this is also a tweet from the documentation from that time, where Taylor Otwell, the creator of Laravel, has written that current React learning status overwhelmed learning Vue.js because it looks easy and has pretty website. So this helped also Vue. And if you see jobs for Laravel and PHP, you also often see that they use Vue. So that's why the PHP and Laravel community and Vue have something in common. And yeah, this helped definitely the growing of Vue. Now, of course, a general reason why we want to have JavaScript frameworks is because the way we have written many years ago is not idle, because this is just a simple HTML. We have a button. And now let's say you have a requirement to click on a button and increase the state. What you could do, you add a script tag, then you need to find your button, and then you need to add an event listener. And then what you here need to do is you both update the count and also the DOM. So every time you want to change the DOM in the end, you always write so much code, which is here maybe trivial, but imagine you have a bigger website, then it can propose and you have to add more and more code. That's why in general, all the frameworks, the idea is always that somewhere we have data and the UI should just change automatically. We should not think about that. I think it's still worth to understand what really happens under the hood, but I like this way of writing declarative code. That's why, how would it be in Vue? So in Vue, we have a template, and the template in the end behaves in the same way as HTML. Then we have a script part, and on the script part, we write all our JavaScript or TypeScript logic. Then now we first see something Vue related. We see ref. So ref is, if you know React, there you have Vue state, but with ref we can declare a reactive variable. And every time that we increase the count itself, the template will also update. So before we saw that with vanilla JavaScript, we have to do these things ourselves, but here there is no event listener. We don't need to find the button, nothing. We have much less code. And in my opinion, it's also more readable. That's why important is to understand the ref. So the data lives in the ref, and you only declare something if it should be reactive. reactive means that the DOM needs to show something. And our template shows the data directly. And if something changes, Vue will handle the magic. So we don't need to deal with this JavaScript. Now again, Vue, when you talk about a Vue component, you say it's a single file component. You always have a template part. Then we have our script part. And then optional, because not always you need to have styling. Or if you use Tailwind, you could also just add it into the template, is our style part. There you can use vanilla CSS, and also maybe here, importantly, scoped. This is what you can use, that this component styling would only affect this component and not your global CSS. So that's why in Vue, we just have one component, 3 things in one component. And I like that idea. Now, how would this look? So here you see a playground, and if I click around, it's interactive, it will change. Here, instead of counting, I could also just do the opposite. So we have our ref, this is reactive. And yeah, the first value was 0, but you could also declare it as a 1. And also, as I said, we can add styling to that. But I must say I'm really bad with CSS, so I don't do anything fancy here. I just change the color. Yeah, this is what I can do. But here, this would basically mean, even if it's one component, that you would change the color of all buttons, not only for this. That's why Vue gives you this helper, and then you know that you would only change the color here. Because another way to do that, if you know that, would be BEM, that you have more precise selectors for this. But if you use Vue, you don't have to think about it. And yeah, this is the basic of Vue to understand. You always have a script part, style part, template part. Also, what I forgot to tell you is, at the moment, this is just JavaScript. But best practices, I think, and I'm a huge fan of it, is to use TypeScript. So now we would get a TypeScript error. So if we would do, for example, something like this here, then we declare it as a, okay, it still is a string. Maybe I need to refresh. But with TypeScript, if I would declare it as type, and I would use not as number or string, I would get an error here. So that's important. And now maybe this is a bit too advanced, but I think it's always worth to, this I think the main problem also with React is to understand what these reactive variables really are and understand a little bit how they work. So that's why we will build our own ref. How will we build it? We declare an effects. So we have a set. If you don't know what this is, you probably know what an array is. The advantage of set is the keys can be unique, and it can be a string or object, but you have no idea. You can think of it like an array. And then we have a function, we call it effect. And what effect will do, it will add the function itself into our set, and it will also immediately trigger the function. Now we have our simplified ref. So we have our getter and setter. Get just returns what you have. And we use closure here. So this means once you create it, this function value is state of the function itself. And then we have a set. And every time we change the value, we will trigger all the effects that exist. So these are, I don't know, 10, 15 lines of code. Of course, in the real implementation, it's much more complicated because there are many problems with this approach. But if you would then do this here, what would happen is when you trigger this line is that the console log will also be executed. And for us, we don't execute console log if we change the ref, but what we will do is that we will update the DOM automatically. So this is the main idea of ref. So as I said, when you read a new value, we will need to track it somewhere that we know, okay, this value, when I do something, should do a console log, for example. And when we write something, then we will just rerun every effect that cares about this value. So this is why also in Vue, you don't need to use something like use memo from React because the reactivity is fine granular. You will only execute something when the values really would have changed. In Vue, we have watch effect, so we don't have effect, but this would be the same in Vue. And yeah, you also see here we declared as a type with a generic, but this is in the end the same idea. And if you really want to understand it, so you could also just check out the source code and then you would see the ideas there, but it's much more complicated. But I also don't think it's complete magic. So that's why I like to understand these primitives. And yeah, here with watch effect, you can basically add anything you want here. So any value, and every time this value would change, you would also run a console log. Of course, console log here is not so useful, but we could, for example, also make an API call when something has changed. Maybe this would be more useful. Now, yeah, here's my nice drawing. And let's talk about components, because the components are important for every framework. And let's imagine we have our app.vue, which is our parent component. And then we have our modal. And then you have OK or cancel. So these are our button components. So what is a component in Vue? You can call in local brains. So in the end, it's a function which is own scope. And each component could have its own state as a ref. It doesn't has to, but could. And ideally, each component only controls one part of the DOM. In a button, it's simple. A base button component should only do something with a button. It should not make an API call or render a table. And with components, we can do composition and we can combine code much simpler. We can get rid of duplication. So this is not something unique to Vue. These are all the frameworks, they use components. And yeah, let's see how our first component could look. So here you see, if I click around, that each of the component has its own ref. And what I could also do is I just add a new one. So a counter, and then you see, if you look up the implementation, that we just have a button that will will increase the count directly and will display it. So here, all the state is only in the counter component. The parent doesn't even know what the counter is doing. And then we can just import it. Now, a different example is we again have our components, but we do now different things. Maybe let's look into the counter. So the first thing is that in Vue, if you have a parent and the child needs to access some data, you use define props. Define props basically means that our counter now has a start, and the component will use the start as the initial value. So in our example before, the count itself always had the 0, but now the child gets the start from the parent. And every time we click on something, you see here with at click, we do increment. We will update the state, but we also will tell the parent that something has happened. And the reason why we tell the parent that is that the parent knows the count of both of the components. So this is in Vue, you have a component, you have a parent and a child, and the parent gives the child the property props. And if the child wants to change state or wants to notify the parent that something has happened, we use define emits. And also what I like about Vue is that we have type safety. So here we define that this event needs to have the name increment. And if we want to do something different, then we get a type error. This is the basic, and most of your components should use the simple props emits communication. That's why the parent gives the child props, and the child emits then something to the parent. Now in Vue, you often have this problem maybe that you need to reuse logic, not UI logic. For UI logic, we can just use components. But if we want to reuse logic, we have composables. And yeah, what are composables? They are functions that use Vue's reactivity system. So a utility function would not use ref, for example. And they can extract and reuse logic across components. And a convention in Vue is that you should use the prefix name use. Then it's clear for developers in a project that this is a composable and not a utility function. And they can return reactive state. So let's start with this simple example. We again have our counter, we have our ref. And now let's say you have the requirement to only extract the logic of what it means to be a counter. And what a counter is doing in the end, it has some state and it will add 1 to the state. So the first step would be you create a new file, you call it use counter, we import ref from Vue, and then we have a function, and the function itself has the state, and the function also gives the outside world a method to manipulate the state. Because this increment is a kind of implementation detail. Here it's simple, but on real world composables, the logic could be more complex. And then now our component, UI component, can use this counter. And now we could also have a counter that is maybe not a button, but a different element. So we have a separation between pure UI and pure logic. And this can help us with getting rid of duplication, have code that is easier to test. That's why when you understand composables and you know how to use them, you know many things about Vue. Just quickly some also interesting things, but as I said, we don't have 1 week that I can explain to you everything that you can do with Vue. As you saw, the value is text binding. But if we use that on template, this means we can show reactive variables. With and click, we can emit events. If we need to display styling depending on reactive state. This is how we can do that. And if we need to list down multiple items, we can use v-for. And oftentimes you only want to show one component depending on a state. There we have v-if and v-show. Here important, view-if would destroy the component completely from the DOM, and v-show would not destroy it. It would just change the CSS. So if you have a functionality where the user often can click and performance is important, then you would use v-show. If you have maybe a more complex form, and then you would use v-if, because then the whole component would be destroyed. And yeah. And we also have view-model. I will talk about view-model later. So just quickly, here is all the first one where we display dynamic CSS. And here we have a simple toggle where we either use v-if or v-show. And here, these bullet points, there we use v-for. So maybe let's start with the styling. So we see when is on is active, we display on and off, and on and off is just this simple CSS class. That's why we change it. But this is a nice way to render different CSS in Vue. For our list items, we have our to-dos, and there we use v-for. And here we also add our key, and then we display the text. So this is how we can do loops in Vue. Adding the key is important because this helps Vue to identify which element it should render or not. I think if you use ESLint, you would also get a warning if you don't add a key. And this key should be unique. And there we have our conditions. So v-show, v-if, and v-show. They kind of do the same. The only difference with v-show is that this part of the DOM will always be visible. We will just use CSS to hide it. And this part of the DOM would fully be gone from the DOM. And yeah, this were just basics, but there are much more Vue related things, but I thought it's maybe interesting to give you more Vue APIs. Now, one important part in Vue is also the difference between computed and watch. We already know ref. So ref, we declare a price and a quantity. And maybe you need to show the total. So every time price or quantity is changing, you want to show the total. The way to do that in Vue is to use computed. And computed is in the end a pure function. So every time we change a value, it will update it. And it also has caching. One thing that is important, that also took me a while to understand when I started with learning Vue, is the difference between computed and watch. So on computed, we don't want to have any side effects. So a side effect can be console log. It could also be that you call an API. So you do something where you don't know what would happen. If you would make an API call in the computed to get the values, you don't know if the API call would throw an error and so on. That's why all these side effects are always under watch. And this is also what takes a while to understand, that computed is most of the time, if you just need to recalculate state, the way to go. And also if you use ESLint, which I would recommend, you would also get a warning if you do side effects inside a computed. So if you know React, on React you have use effect, but this is one thing that I don't understand about React, because use effect is doing kind of both of the things, but it's a bit harder to understand when you do something like computed or when you do a side effect like watch. That's why I like that about Vue. And as I said, two-way data binding. So sometimes you have a parent and you have a child, and every time the child is changing property, you want to update state on the parent. The way to do that is with data binding. So the approach without define model would be that you have an input field. There you say we have our value, and then you have an event listener. And then every time you change something, the parent can do something. But the nicer way and a bit of a syntax sugar is to use Vue model. That's why if you work with forms, you will always see Vue model because it does two things at the same time. But if you have a bug, it's still worth to understand what really happens, that there are two things happening at the same time. And here you see this could be a form where it immediately will change the values. And the way this works is that here we define our state. And there we have our HTML input fields. And then we just use Vue model. And every time we do something, they will immediately update the state for us. Yeah, this was kind of the more interesting APIs, a bit of introduction. Now, of course, the way to create a Vue application, you can go to the docs, then you can run npm create Vue latest, and then you can fill things out, create it with TypeScript and so on. But also what you can do with Vue is, because it's a progressive framework, you can just download the full code from a CDN. You can include it into your HTML. And then we declare our button. And then you have Vue available inside your script. So you don't need any build process, nothing. You can use Vue. This, I think, is also can sometimes be useful. But yeah, most of the time you will create a new application with Byte. Now, what could be the next steps? Yeah, read documentation. I know not most developers don't read documentation, but it's a good documentation. Yeah, just build your own projects. Maybe build a to-do app. And also what we didn't talk about is testing. So I'm a huge fan of testing. And we talked about composables. And if you want to understand how to write good composables, and if you also don't want to build all the composables yourself, there's a good library out there called Vue.use. And there are also many good UI libraries out there that you can either use, or you can also just read the code and to understand how they work. And yeah, have fun, experiment, and try out these different things. So just a quick recap what we learned, that data lives in refs, templates react to data change. We talked a bit about effects and also about components. But before I start my presentation, I thought I'd give you now an example about something really complicated. And if you have no idea about Vue, you probably don't understand it. But I thought maybe as a spoiler, and you could also read it up, is how you would build a JSON viewer. So the idea of a JSON viewer is that you can click around, and if you click, it will open the attributes. So this can be useful if you need to debug something from a backend API and it's not so readable. You could maybe just pass a JSON and then you have a nice UI. So I think this is an interesting problem to do that because, yeah, it's a bit like an accordion, but there are now many ways to solve that simple problem. That's why on my blog, I have written about that. And I also added the source code. You can look that up. But we will talk shortly about my solution. So we already talked about parents and childs with props and limits. We also have something in Vue called provide and inject. And what provide and eject is doing is that if a parent is using provide, there could be just some state. Any child, doesn't matter if it's under the child, doesn't matter how deep it's listed, could have access to the state or to a function. So this is one ingredient for this solution. And another one is recursion. So there is an element in the end just called, how did I call it? Vue.js node here. And it will either display an array or an object and will handle the accordion logic. And there's also a component which is using provide. So maybe I now show you the source code. Here, these things are just for debug reasons, because what this component is doing is every time I click on something, it needs to remember which accordion you have opened, which path you have opened. So that's why you see now at the moment root and root features is opened. So features, and now settings would also be opened. And the parent knows which paths are opened. Now if I close it, everything will be gone, and nothing will be opened anymore. Now I will just try to explain you that, but it's complicated, and if you want to understand it, I think you need to look up the source code. But I want to give you a hint which cool things you can do with Vue. So we have our app component. We have our JSON data. So this is just a typical JSON. And we have here some functions, but they're only used that we can show the debugging here and what happens. And then we have our main component. So this is kind of the brain component, the Vue.json viewer component. And what this is doing is it's using provide from Vue. And it's importing the component, and it's also importing a key. So this key is useful because the problem with provide and eject is that somewhere the child needs to know which things it should listen to. That's why we use symbol. This is part of TypeScript. This guarantees us that this value is always unique. And then you see the JSON viewer key has a toggle node, and it is expanded node, expand all. It was JSON viewer. And this is what we then use. So we declare, this is our state in the end. This here is this part. So as I said, if you click on it, the parent component knows which elements you have clicked on that. But now comes the interesting part. It has a toggle node component. And this toggle node will be available for every child component. And here it will just either delete the path or will add it. So if it was not opened before, it would add it. So now it has added the settings. If I want to close it, it will remove it. Now, the moment you know every time which accordions should open or not, then it's easy to display that. So this is the main hard part. And we provide that. So now every component under the app component has access to that. So it can manipulate state directly. And the component is then using our JSON node. So here you see there's no UI there. So this parent component, this is just a class, but we don't see any accordion. We don't see here the color red, nothing. All this UI related part is now, need to click here. All this UI related part is here, because the components gets the path. So the child component knows that it's a root feature. It knows that it's a root example one. And then, because it knows which path it has, and the parent gives it the state which are open, it can use the functions to display it. So maybe I'll show you the template, but yeah, this is complicated. So I don't expect you to understand it in the first try, but here the component, it has some if statements to know when it should be expandable or not. And if you look up is expandable, we see it is expandable. Here we have a computed, and there the computed gets the props and it knows if it's expandable or not. And then if it's expandable, then we will show the accordion. And we also do recursion. Yeah. So this maybe has confused you, but yeah, I thought I want to show you the interesting part where you can use that. And also one way where you can use it if you want to build a tab component. This would also be an example where you can use this provide and eject technique. And one last thing about provide and eject, if you ever used Pinia or Vue Router, they in the end all also use provide and eject. Just so information. So it's an interesting API that we have in Vue. But yeah, this was my short or not so short introduction to Vue. I hope it was interesting. The main idea was that I hope you understand the basics, script template, refs, and yeah, if you are more interested, feel free to play with that. If you have questions, you can always write me on my website. You see all my socials, and yeah.
Thank you so much for the great presentation and introduction to Vue, Alex. Very useful and practical examples. We do have a few questions in the chat. The first is, are you using Composition API? I think you showed it.
Okay, I didn't talk about it because there is also options API. And yeah, I know sometimes in the Vue community there is a discussion and so on, but my opinion is Composition API is the best way to go, and that's why I didn't even talk about Options API. So everything that I was explaining was Composition API with script setup. Yeah.
Thank you. We do have another question. What makes the single file component format so powerful in Vue?
Yeah, I think that the advantage is that if you have a button, everything that is related to a button is in one place. So you open the file and you see the styling, you see the template part, and you also see the JavaScript or TypeScript part. Of course, the downside of this is that in projects, you need to be aware that you don't end up with components that have 2,000 or 3,000 of lines, because you can do that fast. But the powerful thing is that we deal with we have everything is in one file. So you can build your building blocks, and you don't need to open different files to understand how the button is styled and so on. That's why I liked it. Yeah.
Perfect. Another question, how component pass data between each others?
That does it mean between siblings, kind of, that you have kind of components next to each other and not apparent and under it. There also, if this is the question, then yeah, one way of course would be, I think I still share my screen. One way, that is a good question. So one way could be that let's say this is our app.vue component, and these are the components that need to communicate something with each other. One way could be that the child component emits something, and then the parent updates the state. So this could be one way, but this is not so nice. Now you have many ways in Vue to deal with that. One way could be to use an event bus. So you emit something, and then you have a listener. This could be one way. Another way could be that you use a composable, and the composable itself can share state when you don't declare the ref inside the component. So if you would have a ref here and you would have a function here, then the state would be shared. So this could be one way, but then this doesn't work when you use Nuxt. Then the next way would be you could use Pinia, but Pinia is the state solution, and I think this should be always be your last option. So you basically have many options to deal with the problem, and yeah, this is the hard part about Vue, to know which option you should choose when. And as we always say, it depends. Yeah. I hope this answered the question.
Thank you for the great explanation. We do have another question. How relevant is Vue in today's job market, and in what kinds of projects or companies is it most commonly used? That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it depends. What I also didn't say is that Vue is popular in Asia and China. I don't know if it's more popular than React, to be honest, but I think it's more used than in Europe and USA. Yeah, I think we have this. We have React, Angular, and Vue kind of. These are the big three. And what I can say for Germany, many enterprise companies use Angular. And then also many companies use Vue, but React is still the most popular. So if career-wise, if you're a front-end developer, I think you should know React because most of the jobs are there, and then you can just go with what you like more. If you like more Vue or Angular, but the more frameworks you know, the more jobs you could apply for in the end. And yeah, that's why from the big three, I think Angular, I don't know if Vue if they're on the same level, but it's clear that most jobs are out there for React besides of Asia. And where you can use it for everything. So I didn't talk about Nuxt, but Vue, we only have single page application, but with Nuxt, Next.js would be the equivalent for React. You can also build e-commerce websites with server-side rendering. Or if you have a blog and you only have static sites, you can also use that for Nuxt. And the cool thing with Nuxt is you can also configure it that only one page needs to have server-side rendering and the rest is maybe an SPA. So we can build everything with Vue. Yeah.
That's amazing. Can you share a real-world project where Vue made a big difference in development speed or user experience? Are you aware of something?
Yeah, I think you can build good projects with Angular framework or Vue. So I know sometimes developers discuss about it, but I think there is no difference. I think what was interesting is to find out open source projects because company wise you always can't tell which framework and so on you use. but I don't have one project in mind. But as I said, I don't think the reason why you can't build good software is because you use React or Vue. I think this is not the problem. Do you have other problems about that?
Thank you for the answer. And because most of our members have experience with React, what resources or projects would you recommend to someone who wants to go beyond the basics of Vue?
I think it always depends how you learn something new. But as I said, the best way to start is with the documentation. So documentation is always good. And then it depends. Do you learn better by coding? Do you learn better by watching something? There are also good YouTube channels out there. So free resources, we have it. But I would recommend to start with the documentation, to build something. And also now, because I use AI highly, is you can also use AI to learn something. You can say, I'm a React developer. I know how to solve the problem with React. How can I solve that with Vue? This can also help. This is what I do when I want to understand more about React. But yeah.
Amazing. And also, people can read your blog, so we can learn more. Sophia says that she thinks the Alibaba site is built on Vue.
Which site?
Alibaba.
Yeah. This is right. It's a big company from China, and their Vue is also big because the creator of Vue is Chinese. But you see that also what I mentioned in the Vue documentary. There's also a part where they explain why Vue is big in Asia.
Great. We should definitely watch the documentary. I don't see any more questions in chat, but it was very great session. Thank you for the amazing tips and